Welcome to Slumber Stories, where we share calming, fictional tales designed to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Tonight's story is told in a soft, dreamlike style, the kind of tale that glows gently in the background as you let your thoughts settle. If you enjoy bedtime storytelling, please remember to like this video and subscribe to Slumber Stories, so you can find your way back whenever you need another night of gentle fiction. The year was 1883. Steam filled the air of the seaside town, and the great machines of the industrial age exhaled in every street. Ships at harbour hissed like kettles, and along the cobbled lanes, lamps burned with a yellow smoky light. Amidst the noise of progress, in a narrow brick building at the edge of town, Dr. Eliza Morecroft worked alone. Her laboratory was a cluttered sanctuary. Brass scales balanced beside jars of saltwater specimens. Rolled papers crowded one another on shelves. The air smelled of oil, ink, and the faint tang of the sea. It was here, on a plain wooden desk, that the pebble first came to rest. It had arrived without ceremony, carried by a boy who sold shells and curios from the tide pools. His hands were red from the cold spray of the sea. He tipped his cap shyly and placed the stone before her, saying only, "Found this at low tide, miss. Thought you might want it for your cabinet." She gave him a penny, more for kindness than for interest, and set the stone among the clutter of her desk, where it remained unnoticed. For days it lay forgotten. Then, on a damp September evening, Eliza caught sight of it again. The lamps had been lowered, and the last of the daylight had drained from the window. In the half-dark, she saw it, a faint shimmer trembling across the stone's smooth surface. At first she dismissed it. Perhaps the glass of the lantern had caught it strangely, but when she leaned closer, the glow dimmed. When she drew back, it steadied. She paused, uncertain, and then, quite without thinking, she hummed a few notes of an old lullaby. The glow answered her, not sharply, but gently, like the swell of a candle flame. She laughed aloud at the absurdity of it. A stone that glowed to sound? Impossible. She closed her notebook for the night and told herself it was fatigue. Yet as she prepared for bed, she found her mind circling back to that pale shimmer. The next evening, she tried again. She placed the pebble carefully on a square of black velvet, so there could be no trick of reflection. The laboratory was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the distant sigh of waves against the harbour wall. She waited. The pebble glowed faintly. She hummed. The glow steadied. She fell silent. It waned. The pattern repeated, unshakable, undeniable. Eliza tested it as any scientist might. She weighed the pebble on her brass scales. It was light, lighter than it ought to be for its size. Yet its weight did not change, no matter how brightly it glowed. She submerged it in a jar of seawater, and the glow flickered gently through the ripples. She held a flame near it, and the stone remained unimpressed, shining faintly but steadily in defiance of the fire. Only her voice coaxed it to life. The lower her humming, the brighter it grew. High, sharp notes brought only a faint flicker, but a low hum filled the room with gentle light. In the days that followed, the pebble became her companion. She rose early, but found herself longing for nightfall, when the lamp was dim and the pebble might answer her again. She spoke to it, softly, as one might to a sleeping child, though she scolded herself for the foolishness of it. It was no living thing, and yet she could not deny the sense that it listened. One evening she left her teacup beside it, and to her astonishment the steam seemed to stir it as surely as her humming did. The glow deepened, warmed, as though the pebble was drawing in the heat of the air. Another night her old cat crept onto the desk and curled against the velvet. The stone brightened instantly, pulsing in rhythm with the animal's purring. She took careful notes. The glow was strongest after sunset, as though it preferred the darkness. It answered to warmth, to vibration, to sound. It seemed almost to breathe in the presence of living things. Eliza began to imagine the pebble as a relic of some hidden science, a mineral that had remembered how to listen. She gave the name acoustic mineralogy to the curious study she had begun, though she knew full well the term was nonsense. Still, it soothed her to give the phenomenon a name. Outside her windows the age of steam thundered forward. Engines roared, factories glowed with fire, iron tracks spread across the earth. But within the little laboratory, time slowed. Hours slipped by in the hush of humming, in the pale glow that spilled across brass instruments and ink-stained papers. Once, in the stillness, she fancied she heard something in return. A faint exhalation, like the smallest sigh. She knew it must be her imagination, yet she could not shake the thought. The pebble was not steady in its responses. Some nights it flickered nervously, as though reluctant. Other nights it shone with a quiet confidence, pulsing slow and deliberate, like the rhythm of breath. She wondered if it had moods, if it remembered, if it longed. Such thoughts she dismissed in daylight, but in the dark they returned unbidden. She began experiments in earnest. She placed the pebble near vibrating strings, and it brightened faintly. She held it beside ticking clocks, and the glow shivered in time with the pendulum's swing. She even carried it briefly outdoors, to the edge of the tide pools where it had first been found. There, under the moonlight, the glow was the strongest she had ever seen. Soft, wide, and full, like a pearl caught in the tide. Returning it to her desk, she felt a curious protectiveness toward it, as though it were not an object of study, but a fragile companion. She wondered if she ought to tell anyone. For now, she kept it to herself. To most of the town, she was simply another eccentric scholar, forever jotting notes and polishing brass instruments. They would not believe her. Not yet. And so the secret remained between her and the pebble. Night after night, the laboratory became a chamber of humming and light. The stone rested upon its velvet square, glowing faintly, patiently, as if listening not only to Eliza Morecroft, but to the whole of the world around it. The days shortened, and with them the light in the narrow laboratory. Evening came sooner, pressing its soft weight against the shutters and pooling in the corners where brass instruments dozed. Eliza Morecroft worked by a smaller lamp now, preferring the hush it invited. The pebble remained on its square of velvet, a pale thumbprint of stone that answered to presence with patient light, like an ember that had chosen not to burn. In time, she understood that her solitude had reached its proper limit. Some discoveries are too quiet to keep entirely alone. She wanted, without quite saying so, the steadiness of another's eye upon the thing that had begun to reorder the hours of her life. And so, One afternoon, washed in slate-coloured rain, Eliza composed a letter to the only person who had both the gentleness and the stubborn skepticism she needed, her old mentor, Professor James Aldwych. She wrote without flourish, describing the tests as plainly as she could. The glow rising to low humming, the soft response to warmth and living breath, the indifference to machines. She did not ask him to believe. She only asked him to come when it was convenient and to look carefully. Then she sealed the letter, and the sound of sealing wax cooling upon the paper felt curiously final, as if she had placed a cool fingertip upon her own hesitation. Aldwych arrived 2 evenings later, leaning on a cane he did not entirely need, a habit more than a necessity. He had the look of a man who had made peace with time's velocity, white beard, ink-blue eyes, and a slow kindness that kept pace with his speech. He stood for a moment in the doorway to let the sea air pass around him, and then stepped into the room that had once been the storeroom of a chandlery, now fragrant with oil and salt, and the faint iron tang of the harbour. "Your kingdom of brass," he murmured, glancing at the scales, the lenses, the rows of labelled bottles. "And what petitioners do you keep today?" Eliza offered him tea, and the two of them settled near the desk. The pebble lay between them, smaller than either had imagined it in the other's mind. Aldwych smiled, the way one smiles at a good joke before hearing its punchline. "A stone," he said softly, and then, as if to himself, "Of course." Eliza lowered the lamps. She did not rush him. The lab took on its familiar dusk, the sort that held stillness as a piece of glass holds light. She hummed a note low in her throat. The glow began, tentative, then sure, no brighter than a pearl kept in a shadowed hand. Aldwych leaned forward, eyes attentive and unshowy, as if listening for a faint confession. When Eliza fell quiet, the pebble's light thinned and went on breathing in that way it had. He asked to try. His voice was rougher than hers, a reedier instrument, pitched by years to the keynote of caution. Still, when he hummed, the glow returned and held steady, as if the stone recognized sincerity as easily as it recognized sound. They spoke little, and what they said was practical. He asked if she had weighed it at intervals. She had. He asked if heat alone, without sound, could rouse it. Sometimes, yes, as the steam from a cup or the purr of the cat. He asked if there were others like it. No, not yet. Aldwych removed his spectacles and polished them with unnecessary care. "A phosphor of some kind," he said at last, not unkindly. "The sea leaves many such tricks in its wake. And yet," the yet hung in the air like a small chandelier, refracting possibilities. "And yet I have seen phosphors. They do not choose when to glow." Eliza felt the small relief of being met in a difficult place. He did not name it miracle, nor did he strip it of its strangeness. He placed it carefully in the middle space where scrutiny breathes. He requested to visit again, and in the days that followed, he did. He would arrive with a mild joke about the weather, and then fold himself into the hush as easily as a coat onto a peg. Together they tried predictable things, covering the stone with glass, placing it in a bell jar and pumping the air thin, striking a tuning fork and holding the vibrating tine near the surface. The tuning fork made the glow ripple, but no more than a low hum already did. The diminished air seemed to hunch the light rather than extinguish it. Glass changed little. Heat, in small doses, was welcomed like company. On one of these evenings, after the experiments had ambled to their usual soft conclusions, Aldwych tapped the cane against his shoe and gave the room a second, slower look. "You have been gentle with your question," he said. "That is good. Gentleness is not the same as credulity, but sooner or later someone will arrive who is not gentle at all. And when they do, they will want to take this from you, Eliza. Your silence, your pace, perhaps the stone itself." She nodded and tucked his warning into the ledger of things to keep. The pebble glowed quietly, as if acknowledging the truth without either fearing or endorsing it. The someone arrived sooner than she had expected, and he was not, in fact, unkind, only thorough. A letter came stamped with a foreign crest and a careful hand. Dr. Heinrich Rademacher of Zurich, formerly Munich, formerly the University of somewhere with a roof that leaked in autumn, he would later explain with the amused fatigue of a travelling scholar, had read a private note forwarded by a colleague of a colleague. How such notes find their way is its own kind of mineralogy, and was passing through England on studies of coastal formations. Might he see the stone? Might he bring a few instruments, nothing invasive, only musical and patient? Eliza weighed the request in the scales of her mind and found it slightly heavier than her comfort and slightly lighter than her caution. She wrote, "Yes." Rademacher arrived wrapped in a coat of wet wool and travel. He was tall, with a forehead like a turned page, and the sort of neatness that suggests a man who has learned to create order where trains and tides fail to provide it. He shook her hand, took in the laboratory at a glance, and set a small leather case on the table with a touch of reverence that one might reserve for a violin. His English was careful, no less precise for being gentle, and his questions were the sort that nest one within the next. How long had she owned it? Had it ever cracked? Did the glow persist at exactly the same intensity each night? Did the quality of the sound, vowel more than pitch, breathiness more than resonance, change its behaviour? She answered as best she could, then lowered the lamps and hummed. The light rose dutifully, a familiar guest called by name. Rademacher watched, the way a person watches their own hand while it falls asleep. Curiosity mingled with a strange, interior patience. When she invited him to try, he did not hesitate. The note he produced was not quite a note, more a line smoothed by travel and coffee, and the pebble seemed to lean toward it anyway. After a time, he unlatched the leather case. Inside, instruments lay on velvet like restrained birds. Tuning forks of various sizes, a tiny harmonium with bellows no larger than a book, a pair of glass bells with stems, and a rod threaded with sand. He explained that the bells were for coaxing resonance, the forks for marking specific pitches, the sanded rod for making visible the secret shapes of vibration. These, he said, were the habits of his work. To invite the invisible to draw its pattern on the visible, and then to say, "Ah, there you are." He began with a fork near the pitch of Eliza's hum. The tine kissed the air with a shy shimmer, and the pebble answered. He tried a fork higher, and then higher still. The stone obliged with less enthusiasm, as if climbing a set of stairs it had no particular reason to climb. When he returned to the lower fork, the glow widened and held. He nodded to himself, a man noting where a river likes to turn. They tried the glass bells. The harmonics trembled the water in a shallow saucer as a preliminary proof of presence. Yes, the room was full of circles, even before anyone called them by name. The pebble responded, not to the brightest or purest tones, but to those that seemed to carry weight in the air, tones with breath and edges. They tried the sanded rod, drawing a violin bow against its rosin-darkened length until standing waves gathered and the sand arranged itself into obedience, lining the quiet places between crests. Rademacher smiled, a small victory smile that acknowledged not the trick, but the persistence of law. The stone's glow fluttered there too, faintly echoing the rod's invisible architecture. He took notes in a compact hand, and then, as the evening knit itself together, surprised Eliza by asking to see the tide pools where the boy had found the stone. Context, he said. Even when context does not explain, it comforts. They went at low tide with lanterns, the shore smelling of rope and iron and salt. The pools lay like pieces of sky dropped carefully into rock. Rademacher knelt with a child's attention, examining the strata, the colours of algae, the small cities of barnacles. He swirled a lantern to test whether the shapes of reflected light might produce confusions a weary eye could misread. The lantern told them nothing that the pebble hadn't already told more quietly. They gathered a tray of pebbles that resembled the original and carried them back like cautious treasure. One by one, in the laboratory's deliberate dusk, they auditioned each stone. None glowed. Some looked willing, like pupils who sit upright and sharpen pencils, but no answer came. A mischief of the sea then, singular and sure. The town began to notice the comings and goings at Eliza's door in the way towns do, not with inspection, but with a growing contour of awareness. The grocer asked if she was taking on pupils again. A fishmonger told her the evening fog had sounded different lately, as if it had learned to wear shoes. A child pressed a penny into her palm and asked if the penny could be made to hum. Eliza smiled and said that money hums constantly, which did not satisfy the child, but seemed to the child's mother exact enough. Aldwych returned to meet Rademacher, and the three of them arranged themselves around the desk as if it were a small hearth. The old professor listened to the geologist's account with a seriousness that admitted both continents and the narrowness of a single room. They spoke of matters that were not large, precisely, but durable. What counts as observation? How a patient fact differs from a tidy story. How naming something clears space in the mind without necessarily illuminating the thing itself. Rademacher asked Eliza what exactly she called this work. She hesitated, as if she were about to confess a fondness for a peculiar song. Acoustic mineralogy, she said, softly enough to give the phrase somewhere to rest. I know. It is not a discipline. The word is a chair I set out for a stranger who might someday need to sit. The geologist considered that and inclined his head. I have set out worse chairs, he said, and Aldwich's beard caught a little of his smile. Tests grew more elaborate in the most restrained ways. They placed the pebble near the harmonium and let a long, low chord settle through the bellow's soft machinery. The glow gathered like a tide around a quiet pier. They arranged a pair of metronomes ticking at slightly different tempos, just to see. The stone did not care about the arithmetic. It cared about the breath between. They placed it beneath a bell jar with a slice of warm bread. Rademacher's improvisation, as if the comfort of a kitchen might change the question. The glow warmed, less to the bread than to the heat that rose from it, as if to say, I prefer company that remembers it is warm. Once, Eliza held the stone in her palm, and Rademacher asked to note the temperature of her skin against the stone surface. He hovered the back of his hand a respectful inch away. "It is lighter than it looks," he observed. And Eliza thought of how some ideas, too, weigh less than the sentences that carry them. At every step they refuse to injure the stone. There is a kind of inquiry that requires breaking. They practice the other kind, the sort that lets the thing keep its wholeness and asks only what it volunteers. On a wet Tuesday that smelled of soot and lemons, Aldwych arrived with a small wooden box. Inside lay a set of brass whistles once used to instruct factory workers in signals that no longer signalled anything. He proposed a simple game: 3 notes in rising order, then 3 in falling, to see whether the sequence mattered. The pebble obliged, but only to the notes that kept to the lower registers, and even then it favoured the pauses. It liked to bloom in the quiet after a tone more than in the tone itself. Aldwych shut the box and patted it, as if it had performed a final task with dignity. Of Rademacher's nightly notes, Eliza learned a little. He had spent winters in lava tunnels, summers in chalk quarries. He cultivated the habit of writing plainly of things that made other men choose large words. He travelled not because he loved movement, but because he loved arrival. Those moments when the world, having been otherwise all day, decided to say yes to a certain question. He told her once, wistfully, that he had always wanted a phenomenon that could be patient with him while he worked it out. "So many things," he said, "require you to understand them in the moment they occur, or else you have nothing later but a description." He glanced at the pebble with the tender envy of a schoolboy watching someone practice scales while the rest of the world rehearsed thunder. Their conversations wandered along a quiet path. Methods, responsibilities, the small ethics of touch and time. Aldwych maintained that science and courtesy were kin. Rademacher allowed that this was unprovable and therefore comforting. Eliza thought of the pebble, which had never once demanded an answer from them, and agreed. When they grew tired of instruments, they returned to ordinary company. The cat, disdaining all abstractions, would climb onto the table and arrange itself with the exactness cats reserve for places they intend to own. The pebble's glow took on that old, companionable warmth, pulsing in harmony with the animal's low engine. Rademacher laughed without mockery. "The animal is a metronome of its own comfort," he said. "The stone prefers this. I begin to believe it has a taste." Eliza did not write papers. She wrote night after night in her ledger, but these were not the scaffolding of public argument. They were letters to her future self, the one who might someday lack the memory of how soft the light had been on a particular Thursday when the rain tapped the sill like patient knuckles. She wrote down small things, that the glow felt rounder when the sea was calm, that it was less certain on nights of sharp wind, that warm bread was a sillier but kinder instrument than a bell jar, and that perhaps kindness had a measurable acoustics of its own. Rademacher stayed longer than he had planned. When he packed his case, it was with the reluctance of a man who has shown his instruments to a mountain that refuses to be carved and is grateful for the refusal. He stood in the doorway, the sea air tugging at his coat, and confessed he had not explained the stone. He had, however, come to understand the size of his ignorance around it, and he found that shape unexpectedly beautiful. He promised to write in the promise a quiet acknowledgement that letters are a way to rehearse presence when presence cannot continue. Aldwich's parting counsel was practical. Record the hours, record the interruptions. Be generous in admitting what you do not know. And sing, he added, as if prescribing a tonic. Not for it, necessarily. For yourself. You are the instrument here as well as the observer. Eliza walked them both to the lane, watched them go in opposite directions, one to a lodging house where the window gave onto gulls, the other to a cottage where clocks retired, and returned to the laboratory with a steadier step than she had had in months. She lowered the lamps. She hummed. The pebble brightened with the equanimity of a friend who has heard this story before and is pleased to hear it again. The town folded their visits into its understanding of Eliza. Oh, she has callers now. Oh, there is talk of a stone. Oh, it is nothing to us, and yet it has changed the way we pass that window. A baker began to leave end pieces of loaves in a small paper bag on her sill. The lamplighter, finishing his rounds, sometimes paused to listen, though he would have said he was only resting. Children pressed their ears to seashells and reported, with the accuracy unique to the very young, that the sea had acquired a second voice, and that both voices were friendly. On certain nights, fog walked in on soft feet and wrapped the lab in a privacy even the shutters could not provide. On those nights, Eliza allowed herself longer hums, not to prove anything, but to keep company with a fact that had chosen to be tender rather than dramatic. She considered briefly the question of names, what to call the glow, what to call the listening. She decided, wisely or merely sleepily, to keep the names simple. Light, warmth, breath, pause, presence. Words that could be understood by a cat and a kettle and a woman alone at her desk. From Rademacher there came, a week after his departure, a letter on thin paper that had learned to hold both humility and enthusiasm without tearing. He recounted their experiments in staccato lines, then softened into a paragraph about patience. How rare it was in their business. How he had learned that some phenomena are less like fires to be contained and more like lakes to be befriended. He signed with the formality of distance and the warmth of a colleague who had, for a brief stretch of evenings, forgotten that oceans are in the habit of keeping friends apart. Aldwych sent no letter. He arrived in person with a bundle of blueprints he did not need her to see. Old lecture diagrams, which, he confessed, contained fewer truths than useful lies. Many of the best diagrams, he said, arranging the sheets on a clear patch of table, are confessions that we would like the world to be simpler. Keep that in mind when anyone arrives with too neat a picture of your stone. The pebble glowed and did not glow, answered and withdrew, waited and wandered in its quiet way. It grew no brighter with fame, because fame had not arrived. It grew no dimmer with scrutiny, because scrutiny had learned to speak softly in that room. Eliza had thought intimacy with a phenomenon might mean learning ever more precise names for its parts. Instead, it meant learning how to remain in the room with it without requiring that it kneel to language. Once, late, when even the factories seemed to be sleeping with one eye open, she carried the pebble to the window. The pane was cool. The harbour moved in a blackness alive with small silver corrections. She held the stone up to the glass and hummed. And for a moment the reflection made it seem as if two pebbles breathed together, the one in her palm and the one in the pane, each consenting to the other's company. She thought of Aldwich's warning and of Rademacher's instruments, and of the boy who had brought the stone to her with cold hands, and no idea he had changed the architecture of one room and by echo a handful of lives. Morning always came eventually, with its practical light and its lessening of mysteries. Eliza answered the door, bought bread, returned library books, and mended the strap on a satchel that had done more work than it had promised. The pebble rested in daylight as an ordinary thing rests, the way a promise does not stop being a promise when no one is speaking it. In the evenings she returned to the work that did not yet know whether it wanted to be called science or listening. She wrote the day's small weather into the ledger, then let the ledger be a ledger and not a summation. She lowered the lamps and allowed the lab to become itself. When she hummed, it was with the knowledge that the note might belong to more than one throat. Her own, Aldwich's, Rademacher's, the cat's small motor, the harbour's deep pipe, the bread's disappearing warmth. The pebble answered as it always had, with a glow that refused to be dramatic and therefore felt truer than drama. Visitors had come, visitors had gone, but the room had not been disturbed, it had been enlarged. There was now more listening in it. The pebble did not brighten to reward this, it simply acknowledged it. And Eliza understood that this, too, was a kind of discovery. That a fact can remain small without being less miraculous. That a company of careful minds can make a silence more spacious. That a stone can teach a scientist how to be both rigorous and kind. Outside, the town returned to itself every hour. Gulls swore their familiar oaths, rails sang, and then were quiet. The sea rehearsed its patience on the rocks. Inside, the square of velvet became again a stage no wider than a hand, on which light practised its softest version of being seen. Aldwych would call in next week. Rademacher would write again in some month that the calendar could not yet name. The boy from the docks would bring shells darker than the one before. The cat would purr in the one key that never needed tuning. And Eliza, arranging pen, ledger, lamp, and the small, attentive stone, would begin the evening's work the way one begins a lullaby sung many times, as if for the first, as if for the thousandth, with gratitude for a phenomenon that preferred the low voice and the long breath. She hummed, and the pebble glowed, faithful, unhurried, unafraid of witnesses, while the world, soothed by its own machinery, tilted gently toward sleep. The pebble never sought fame. It lay quietly on its velvet square, answering only when asked, glowing only when coaxed, never demanding the world's attention. Yet the world, in its roundabout way, began to notice. Not the whole world, only the village, the lanes that wound like threads toward the sea, the marketplace where bread was traded for coins still warm from a pocket, the docks where children scuffed their boots against the salt-stained timbers. Here the whispers gathered, small as sea foam. A baker, delivering loaves in paper, mentioned that Miss Morecroft's windows glowed faintly at night, though no lamp was lit within. The lamplighter, finishing his rounds, sometimes paused to listen at her door, claiming that the air carried a note he could not place. And children always know first, declared that the sea had begun to hum in the evenings, softly, as though rehearsing lullabies with the tide. It was not gossip so much as folklore beginning its first awkward steps. No one called it miracle. No one called it fraud. They only said, in the way towns say things, "Have you noticed?" And once noticed, the noticing continued. Eliza did not court it. She nodded when neighbours asked, and she smiled politely when a fisherman suggested she bottle the glow and sell it to sailors who feared the dark. But she kept the pebble where it belonged, on her desk, in the hush of her laboratory, where the brass instruments could witness it without envy. One winter evening, an engineer from London arrived, sent by a cousin who had heard half a story and embroidered the rest. He was a practical man, trained in steel and coal, whose pockets smelled faintly of smoke and ink. He examined the pebble with the brisk hands of someone accustomed to levers and pulleys, then declared that such a specimen belonged in a proper city laboratory. "Here," he said, "you will only court superstition. There, we could test it, expose it to heat, cold, pressure, force. We might strike it, grind it, split it. The world cannot learn from what is left untouched." Eliza listened, and her silence was longer than politeness demanded. She thought of Aldwich's warning, that someone would come wanting to take the stone, to hurry it into answers it did not wish to give. She thought of Radamach's patience, his reverence for phenomena that resist tidy categories. And she thought of her own nights, when the glow had seemed to breathe with her voice, asking nothing more than company. At last she said, very gently, "The world can also learn from what is left whole." The engineer frowned, confused by gentleness where he expected argument. He left, not unkind, but certain she had squandered the chance to make her name. Yet Eliza felt no loss. The pebble was not hers to barter. It was hers to keep in trust, as one keeps a secret told in confidence. The seasons wheeled on. Winter laid frost on the glass, and the pebble glowed beneath it, a faint lantern against the white. Spring lifted the fog, and the stone seemed to bloom in response, steady and sure. Summer pressed heat against the shutters, and still the pebble glowed, unfazed, as though temperature belonged to another world entirely. Through it all, Eliza remained faithful. Each evening she lowered the lamps, wrote a few words in her ledger, and then allowed herself the simple luxury of humming into the stillness. The stone answered, never more, never less, as though to remind her that consistency can be its own kind of wonder. Sometimes Aldwych visited, bringing no instruments now, only stories of students who had once baffled him, and who now wrote letters full of gratitude they had not felt at the time. He sat by the desk and regarded the pebble with the fondness of a man who has grown older alongside an unanswered question. Sometimes Rademacher wrote from the continent, brief letters on thin paper, recounting caves that sang with dripping water, dunes that whispered beneath boots, mountains that echoed their own names. He never claimed to have found another pebble like hers. His tone suggested he no longer hoped to. Instead, he treated her stone as unique, and uniqueness as a form of abundance rather than lack. As months became years, the town folded the pebble into its quiet identity. Visitors asked if the harbour had always sounded so restful at night. Parents rocked infants to sleep with a hum that felt heavier in the throat than it had before, though they could not say why. The cat grew older, but still it purred beside the velvet square, and still the glow leaned toward its warmth. Folklore sprouted like lichen on stone. Some said the pebble contained a memory of the sea, listening for the tide's return. Others insisted it was a remnant of thunder, stilled into silence but still trembling at the edges. A child swore that if you pressed your ear to it, You could hear not one voice but many, singing from far below the earth. No one believed the child, but no one corrected him either. Eliza let the stories grow wild. They were not weeds, they were vines, climbing toward meanings she did not need to prune. The pebble glowed steadily, indifferent to tales and theories alike, content to be what it was. There were nights when Eliza wondered what would happen if she ceased her humming altogether. Would the pebble dim forever, forgotten in a drawer? Or would it wait, patient as ever, for the next voice willing to sit with it in quiet? The question lingered, unsolved, like an unopened letter. But when such thoughts troubled her, she always found herself returning to the desk, lowering the lamps, and beginning again. Not because the pebble demanded it, but because she found that she did. In a world of factories and deadlines, of railways racing through valleys, there was comfort in a companion that kept no schedule, asked no results, and rewarded only gentleness. The years gave her a gift, the understanding that not all discoveries seek conclusion. Some are not ladders to be climbed, but rooms to be inhabited. Her laboratory became such a room, filled with brass and paper, lamplight and sea air, and one glowing stone that refused to be hurried. One evening, long after the town had grown used to its quiet legend, Eliza placed the pebble on the windowsill. The sea was calm, the tide tugging softly at the harbour stones. She hummed a note lower than speech, letting it roll into the dark like a small boat. The pebble brightened, reflecting faintly in the glass, as though two stones now glowed, one within the room, one within the night itself. She thought then of all the voices it had answered, her own, Aldwich's, Rademacher's, the cat's, even the sigh of steam from a forgotten teacup. A chorus of small presences, gathered not to demand truth, but simply to keep company with mystery. And she understood that this was enough, more than enough. The pebble would glow when it wished, dim when it wished, and in either case it had already given her the rarest of discoveries, a science of listening. Outside, the age of iron thundered on. Trains howled, factories glowed, engines consumed coal as if it were air. But in the little brick building by the sea, time slowed to the rhythm of a hum. Eliza's last thought before extinguishing the lamp was not of theories or fame, but of companionship, the kind that asks nothing more than presence. The pebble glowed faintly against the tide's eternal hush, and she whispered, more to herself than to it, "Perhaps discovery is not what we take from the world, but what we allow it to tell us, if only we learn to listen." And with that, she closed her eyes, while the pebble kept its gentle watch, glowing softly in rhythm with the sea's long breath. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Slumber Stories. I hope tonight's tale carried you gently toward rest. If you'd like more calming fiction, please subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next story. Until then, may your night be quiet, your dreams kind, and your rest complete. Good night.